The world still remembers the same image, first a smile, so bright it could soften an entire room, the kind of smile that once sold fairy tales to millions and made strangers believe love could be simple if you just waited long enough. Julia Roberts built a legend on that light. For more than 3 decades, she was presented as the proof that charm survives, that romance wins, that Hollywood can still deliver happy endings. But there is another version of that story, the one that never fit on a magazine cover, the one that sat behind the lipstick and the flashes and the practiced ease of walking into any spotlight as if it were sunlight. At 57, the weight of that other story feels harder to hide, not because she has lost her fame, but because time has a way of stripping performance down to what it was always protecting. When the rooms go quiet and the cameras move on, what remains is not applause, not headlines, not box office records, but the private inventory of a life. The people you lost, the moments you could not undo, the choices that looked like scandal to strangers but felt like survival to you. The kind of loneliness that does not announce itself loudly, that does not crash through the front door, but instead waits patiently in the corners of a life, showing up when the last guest leaves and the house finally exhales. This story, as it has been told and retold, does not begin with glamour. It begins with fracture. It begins with a young woman learning early that love is not always stable, that the ground can shift under you without warning, that a home can look ordinary from the outside and still feel like weather inside. And that is what makes the public image so haunting. Because when a person becomes a symbol of warmth and romance, the world assumes she must feel warm and safe within her own skin. Yet the cruelest contradiction in celebrity is that adoration does not automatically translate into belonging. You can be known everywhere and still feel unknown in the one place that matters most, your own life. Her romantic history has often been treated like entertainment, a carousel of names and headlines. But the deeper pattern is more unsettling. The closer she seemed to get to a fairy tale ending, the more violently reality pushed back. A wedding called off at the edge of the altar, the kind of abrupt decision that makes the public gasp because it violates the script everyone expects. Then, not long after, a quiet church, a hurried vow, a private attempt to step away from spectacle and into something real, only for that marriage to dissolve in less than 2 years. In the eyes of strangers, these are plot twists. In the inner world of the person living them, they are bruises that do not fade because they are made from hope as much as heartbreak. Fame complicates everything it touches. It magnifies joy until it looks staged, then magnifies pain until it looks like content. Under that glare, intimacy becomes a fragile thing. A dinner turns into a headline. A moment of doubt becomes a rumor. A private argument becomes a story that strangers will repeat with confidence, as if they were in the room. And for someone who once carried a longing for safety, that constant invasion is not merely annoying, it is corrosive. It teaches you to guard yourself, to smile even when you do not feel like smiling, to keep moving even when you are tired because the world's appetite never ends. The most heartbreaking part is that the loneliness described here is not the loneliness of being alone in a physical sense. It is the loneliness of living in a life that so many people feel entitled to hold, interpret, and consume. It is the loneliness of being surrounded by noise while your own inner voice grows quieter, not because you have nothing to say, but because you have learned the cost of being heard. It is the loneliness of knowing that millions can love the idea of you, while very few know what it took to become that idea. And when the story turns toward her earliest years, it suggests that loneliness was not an unexpected visitor. It was a familiar presence, one that taught her how to disappear without leaving the room. A childhood marked by instability, a family home that felt less like shelter and more like something that could break, a young girl learning to measure her footsteps, to manage her breath, to make herself smaller when the air grew tense. Those lessons do not vanish when you become famous. They simply evolve. They become a different kind of vigilance. The child who learned to survive the sounds of a troubled home becomes an adult who learns to survive the sounds of the world demanding more. That is why, at 57, the tragedy described is beyond a single event. It is a long echo. It is the accumulation of abandonment and pressure and public scrutiny, layered over a person who has spent a lifetime converting pain into performance. The smile is real, but it is also a shield. The beauty is real, but it is also a mask. The success is real, but it does not automatically erase the earlier hunger for peace. If the woman with the brightest smile in the world has spent so many years quietly learning how to live with darkness, what does that say about the cost of being adored, and what happens when the applause finally fades? Hunger has a way of clarifying who you are and what you are willing to endure. When Julia Roberts left Georgia in the mid-1980s, she did not arrive in New York as a star in waiting. She arrived as a young woman with a small suitcase, a few $100s, and a belief that was already bruised but not yet broken. The city did not reward belief. It tested it. Every cracked sidewalk, every winter wind cutting through a thin coat, every unanswered audition became another quiet question. How badly do you want this, and what are you willing to give up to keep going? Her first apartment was not the romantic kind that later biographies like to soften with nostalgia. It was cold, narrow, and unforgiving. A broken heater meant nights slept in layers, breath visible in the dim light, the body curled inward not for comfort but for survival. Meals were rationed, instant noodles stretched as far as possible, hunger managed rather than defeated. There's a particular loneliness that comes with poverty when you are young and ambitious, because you're surrounded by millions of people yet feel utterly disposable. The city does not notice your struggle. It simply moves around you. Casting calls became a ritual of small humiliations. Endless waiting rooms. Polite smiles from assistants who would not remember your name 5 minutes later. Scripts read once and then set aside. More than 200 rejections piled up, not dramatically, but quietly, the way erosion works. Each no did not crush her outright. Instead, it asked her to carry doubt home and unpack it alone. On snow-filled nights, she would walk back under yellow streetlights, whispering the same promise to herself again and again. Try again. Not because she felt strong, but because stopping felt worse. The breakthrough, when it came, was almost insultingly small. A fleeting appearance in a commercial. A smile captured for a few seconds. Yet that smile earned her something far more valuable than money. A union card, a fragile key into a world that had kept its doors firmly shut. It was not victory. It was permission. And permission, in Hollywood, can mean the difference between existing and disappearing. Her first television role did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with exhaustion. She was ill on set, her body already strained by years of living on the edge. Studio lights burned hot, smoke effects went wrong, and she left with minor burns on her skin. The story lingers on this detail, not for spectacle, but for symbolism. Even at the beginning, the work demanded pain. Physical scars appeared alongside emotional ones, as if the body were keeping pace with the history she carried inside. There is a moment in this chapter that defines everything that follows. Alone in her apartment, surrounded by empty cupboards, Julia looked at the one object she had guarded through every move and every setback. Her father's old watch. It was more than an heirloom. It was time itself, measured and remembered, a tangible link to the one person who had once made her feel safe. Selling it meant survival. Keeping it meant hunger. With shaking hands, she chose survival. The pawnshop did not care about the story attached to the watch. The clerk counted bills without curiosity. Tears fell anyway, blurring the face of the watch as if time itself were dissolving. In that moment, she was not an actress chasing a dream. She was a daughter losing her father all over again. Years later, when she had the power to do so, she would search for that watch and buy it back. Not to wear it, but to reclaim the part of herself she had been forced to trade. Some losses can be reversed. Others can only be honored. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the industry began to notice her. Small roles led to slightly bigger ones. Each opportunity was still fragile, still uncertain, but momentum began to replace desperation. Then came the film that shifted perception. a modest production, not designed to create icons. Yet her presence cut through the frame with an intensity critics could not ignore. For the first time, the narrative around her changed. She was no longer just hopeful. She was undeniable. That attention carried her into a role that demanded emotional exposure far beyond her years. Playing a young woman facing mortality required a depth that cannot be faked. On set, there were moments of doubt, moments when she cried alone, aware that she was not the first choice, aware that the room was waiting to see if she would fail. Instead, she reached backward, drawing on abandonment, loss, hunger, and fear, and poured it into the character. The result stunned everyone. Awards followed. So did recognition. At just 22, she stood at the edge of something irreversible. She was no longer invisible. And yet, the story insists on reminding us that success does not arrive as a clean break from suffering. It arrives layered on top of it. The same pain that nearly broke her became the material of her art. The discipline she learned through deprivation became her armor. Resilience stopped being a choice and became her default setting. When a troubled script called Pretty Woman finally made it back from the brink of collapse, she was asked once more to prove herself. One more audition, one more chance to be overlooked. History remembers what followed as magic. But magic, in this telling, is simply preparation meeting permission at exactly the right moment. She stepped onto that set as a young woman who had slept in her coat and sold her father's watch. She stepped off as a star. The world fell in love with her smile, unaware of how much it had already cost. By the end of this phase, Julia Roberts had crossed an invisible line. Poverty was behind her. Hunger was no longer a daily concern. But the habits formed in those years did not disappear. The vigilance, the fear of losing ground, the instinct to keep proving herself even after proof was no longer required. All of it came with her. The tragedy hinted at here is subtle. She escaped survival mode without ever fully leaving it. And as the lights grew brighter, the question lingered quietly beneath the applause. When you spend so many years fighting not to disappear, how do you ever learn how to rest? Love for Julia Roberts was never a side story. It became the most dangerous terrain of her life. Not because she feared intimacy, but because intimacy was the one thing fame refused to leave untouched. As her career accelerated in the early 1990s, the world watched her romantic life with the same hunger it reserved for her films, as if love itself were another role she owed the audience. What unfolded was not a series of careless choices, but a pattern shaped by pressure, longing, and the impossible demand to build something fragile under permanent surveillance. At the height of her rising stardom, Julia was still chasing something older than Hollywood success. She was chasing the idea of home, not the physical structure, but the emotional certainty that someone would stay. Each relationship carried that quiet hope, even when it was buried beneath confidence and charm. Yet fame distorted every attempt. Love, once private and exploratory, became performative. Dates were documented. Gestures were interpreted. Doubts were magnified into speculation. Under those conditions, even sincerity begins to crack. Nothing symbolized that rupture more than the wedding that never happened. It was meant to be a milestone, a public declaration that the girl who had slept in her coat and pawned her father's watch had finally arrived at stability. Invitations were sent. A dress was chosen. The press circled like witnesses waiting for vows. To the outside world, it looked like a fairy tale reaching its final act. To Julia, it slowly began to feel like a trap. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, something shifted. Friends noticed her growing quieter, more distant during fittings and rehearsals meant to celebrate joy. The wedding was no longer about two people choosing each other. It had become an event, a spectacle, a collective expectation. 3 days before walking down the aisle, she did what few people at the center of that much attention dare to do. She walked away. The shock was immediate and unforgiving. Headlines exploded. Fans demanded explanations. The dress hung untouched. Flowers wilted. The world framed it as scandal, indecision, or fear. but stripped of noise. The act itself was simple and devastatingly brave. Julia chose truth over performance. She later admitted that leaving was the hardest thing she had ever done, but also the only thing that felt honest. In an industry that rewards appearances above all else, she refused to fake the most important moment of her life. That decision, however, did not free her from consequences. It branded her as unpredictable, emotionally volatile, a woman who shattered fairy tales instead of completing them. More importantly, it reinforced a painful lesson she had been learning since childhood. Love, when exposed to chaos and expectation, can become something you must escape to survive. The roles she chose afterward reflected that inner fracture. She portrayed women running from danger, enduring illness, clinging to love while bracing for loss. Audiences felt something different in her performances, a deeper current of vulnerability that could not be taught. It was as if the canceled wedding had stripped away the final layer of protection. She was no longer acting pain. She was channeling it. Then came another attempt to step outside the glare. A quiet marriage, rushed and intimate, far from red carpets and camera flashes. For a moment, it seemed she had found a way to separate her private life from her public identity. But the separation did not hold. The marriage dissolved in less than 2 years, not with scandal or cruelty, but with resignation. Two people acknowledging that love alone does not always equal compatibility, especially when both are still learning who they are. By the mid-1990s, Julia Roberts had become the most recognizable romantic lead in the world. Film after film reinforced the image of effortless love, witty banter, and glowing happiness. Couples saw her stories and believed in endings where everyone chose each other in the final scene. The irony was almost cruel. While she embodied romance on screen, her off-screen life remained unsettled, marked by brief connections and the persistent sense of never fully arriving. She once confessed that she had everything, yet nowhere to come home to. It was not a complaint. It was an observation. Fame had given her power, wealth, and admiration, but it had also stolen something essential. Privacy, the freedom to fail quietly, the right to learn love without witnesses. Each relationship after that followed a familiar rhythm. Intensity, hope, intrusion, collapse. The world interpreted these endings as personal flaws, but the deeper truth was structural. It is difficult to build something delicate when every crack is amplified, when strangers feel entitled to commentary, when silence itself becomes suspicious. Under such conditions, love does not simply end. It erodes. This emotional exhaustion did not stop her professionally. In fact, it coincided with the most commanding phase of her career. She shattered box office records, redefined what female stars could earn, and proved she was far more than a romantic symbol. When she stepped into a role that demanded grit, stubbornness, and moral fire, she rewrote the rules of Hollywood compensation and respect. Standing on that award stage, she spoke not as a goddess of glamour, but as a girl from a small town who had survived. Yet even that triumph did not erase the underlying ache. Success resolved questions about her talent, but not about belonging. The tragedy forming here is not dramatic in the traditional sense. It is quiet. It is the realization that external victories cannot repair internal fractures rooted in loss and instability. They can only coexist with them. By the end of this chapter, Julia Roberts was a paradox fully formed. The most desired woman in cinema, the face of love for an entire generation. And yet, privately, someone still navigating the consequences of walking away, starting over, and trying again. Love had not defeated her, but it had wounded her deeply enough to make caution a permanent companion. The heartbreak of this phase lies not in the endings themselves, but in what they reveal. That even at the center of admiration, a person can feel profoundly alone. That choosing honesty can cost you the story others want to believe. And that sometimes the bravest act is not staying and hoping it will work, but leaving before you lose yourself completely. By the turn of the new millennium, something in Julia Roberts began to shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet decisiveness of someone who had finally learned what constant exposure cost the soul. After years of public romances dissected in headlines and endings turned into spectacle, she no longer searched for intensity. She searched for stillness. And in that search, she found a kind of love that did not ask to be seen. This chapter of her life did not arrive like a movie premiere. There were no red carpets, no glossy photographs announcing destiny. Instead, it unfolded behind the camera in the spaces where attention rarely lingers. She met a man whose world revolved around framing stories rather than starring in them. He did not live under the same spotlight. He did not measure worth by applause. Where her life had been defined by visibility, his was shaped by focus and restraint. That difference mattered more than anyone could have predicted. At first, their connection was quiet, almost cautious. The world, trained by years of spectacle, immediately searched for scandal and explanation. Rumors swelled. Timelines were questioned. Motives were guessed at by people who had never met either of them. But for the first time, Julia did not respond. She did not correct the narrative or offer reassurance. Silence became her boundary. Time, she seemed to believe, would either destroy the truth or prove it. She was willing to wait. That waiting was not passive. It was deliberate. For a woman who had spent decades racing from one obligation to the next, slowing down was an act of resistance. She stopped trying to outrun loneliness and instead sat with it, learning its shape. And in that stillness, the relationship deepened not through spectacle, but through routine. Conversations without witnesses, days without cameras, moments that did not need to be explained to anyone else. When she chose to marry again, the contrast to her earlier experiences could not have been more stark. There was no countdown, no orchestrated anticipation, no press releases promising the wedding of a lifetime. She walked down the aisle quietly, on her own terms, surrounded by nature rather than expectation. The ceremony was small, almost hidden, held in a place that felt safe rather than impressive. In that moment, she was not America's sweetheart. She was simply a woman choosing a life. This time the vows held, not because love had suddenly become easy, but because it had become protected. With her partner, she discovered a steadiness that fame had never provided. He did not look at her as a symbol or a fantasy. He saw her as a person shaped by loss, ambition, fear, and resilience. Where the world demanded performance, he offered presence, and that presence changed everything. Motherhood soon followed, reshaping her sense of identity more profoundly than any role ever had. Children introduced a rhythm that did not bend to career cycles or public expectation. Mornings became about breakfast instead of schedules. Evenings became about stories instead of scripts. For the first time, her life was measured not in releases or reviews, but in growth, laughter, and the quiet satisfaction of showing up consistently. She once said that the title she cherished most was not actress, but mother. It was not a rejection of her career, but a reordering of value. Fame had once promised fulfillment. Family offered something rarer, grounding. In building a home away from the noise, she was not retreating from the world. She was reclaiming herself from it. Yet this chapter is not written as a perfect resolution. The video insists on honesty. Peace does not erase grief. It simply makes space to carry it more gently. During these years, Julia endured losses that did not seek public attention. The death of a half-sister carved a quiet hollow that no amount of stability could fill. It was a sorrow she kept close, choosing privacy not out of secrecy, but out of respect for pain that words could not soften. There were other reconciliations as well. Long-standing family rifts, particularly with her brother, began to ease with time and shared vulnerability. Motherhood softened old resentments. Holding new life created room for forgiveness where pride had once stood firm. The past did not vanish, but it loosened its grip. Healing, she seemed to learn, was not about erasing history, but about learning how to live alongside it. Professionally, she became more selective. She no longer chased visibility. She chose roles that resonated with her internal landscape, stories that reflected complexity rather than fantasy. Her appearances became less frequent, but more intentional. This was not decline. It was authorship. She was no longer reacting to the industry's demands. She was shaping her own narrative. In this phase of her life, success stopped looking like domination and started looking like balance. She guarded her privacy fiercely, not out of fear, but out of wisdom earned the hard way. She understood now that peace is fragile, and that protecting it requires saying no far more often than saying yes. The tragedy, if it still exists here, is subtle. Even in happiness, echoes remain. Childhood loss does not dissolve because adulthood improves. It simply grows quieter, appearing in unexpected moments, in memories triggered by ordinary things. But what has changed is her relationship to that pain. It no longer controls her choices. It informs them. By building a life away from constant exposure, Julia Roberts did something radical for a woman of her fame. She chose to be ordinary where it mattered most. Wife, mother, partner, not roles written by anyone else, but lived in real time. And in that choice, she found something Hollywood had promised but could never deliver. Not perfection, not applause, but a home that stayed standing when the lights finally dimmed. Even in a life seemingly surrounded by abundance, Julia Roberts has never escaped the quiet presence of loss. The video frames this not as a single event, but as a cumulative force, a silent enemy, that travels with her through the decades. At 57, she has amassed wealth, fame, and artistic achievement, yet the narrative emphasizes that these external measures cannot erase the scars etched into her earliest memories. Losing her father too young, enduring the fractures of a troubled childhood, and experiencing fleeting or failed relationships. All of these experiences linger in a subtle but persistent way, shaping her emotional landscape. Loneliness, the narrator insists, is not merely physical. It is the gap between public perception and private reality. Millions may adore her, but few truly know the Julia beneath the iconic smile. Fame amplifies visibility while simultaneously reducing intimacy. When every expression is documented, every gesture analyzed, even a quiet moment with a loved one risks intrusion. The video's thesis here is clear. The greatest trials she has faced are often invisible, played out internally while the world marvels at her image. Her private losses are manifold. The passing of a half-sister, quietly mourned, is described as a sorrow that no external applause could alleviate. Even minor, intimate losses, such as the death of a family pet, are rendered meaningful because they punctuate a life filled with both extraordinary public success and ordinary grief. These moments reinforce the narrative that pain is an intrinsic part of her existence, not something that can be erased with a film, an award, or a headline. They serve as reminders that, despite her extraordinary accomplishments, she is human first. The video pays particular attention to how she has learned to navigate these emotions. Her routines, yoga, swimming, walking along beaches or open fields, a disciplined diet, and structured self-care, are framed as strategies for survival and emotional preservation. Privacy, more than wealth, is depicted as her most precious resource. She limits access not out of vanity, but as a form of armor, protecting her family, her peace, and the moments of genuine joy from intrusion. Every role she takes, every public appearance, is a deliberate choice, weighed against what it might cost her inner balance. In this telling, motherhood emerges as a crucial stabilizing force. The video emphasizes the rhythm and grounding that raising children provides. Daily life, breakfast on the porch, laughter echoing through sunlit kitchens, becomes a source of wealth immeasurable by material standards. It is in these ordinary routines that she cultivates serenity, a stark contrast to the unpredictability of fame. The narrator frames her role as a mother not as a distraction from her career, but as a central element of her identity, offering a depth of fulfillment that Hollywood never could. Her philanthropy and advocacy are presented similarly. Rather than seeking attention, Julia's contributions to education, environmental causes, and gender equality are deliberate, understated acts of purpose. They signal that her influence is no longer solely performative, but invested in real-world impact. In the video's framing, this choice reflects maturity and discernment, a life that has moved beyond the external validation of celebrity toward a self-defined sense of worth and legacy. The video continues to underscore that even in this carefully curated life, the shadows of earlier pain remain. The faint echoes of a father's absence, the half-sister's death, or fractured familial relationships are presented not as impediments, but as elements she carries with grace. Her smile, once a shield to hide vulnerability, now symbolizes resilience and understanding. It is no longer simply an image crafted for public consumption, but a reflection of survival, proof that she has endured hardships while retaining her humanity. In parallel, the video revisits her career milestones to highlight the interplay between professional achievement and personal experience. Roles that once required deep emotional exposure are now contextualized as extensions of her own journey. Characters who suffer, endure, or seek redemption serve as mirrors of the struggles she has faced off-screen. This reinforces the narrative that her artistry is inseparable from her lived experience, that the power of her performances stems as much from personal insight as from talent. The concept of balance recurs repeatedly. While fame previously demanded constant visibility and engagement, she now exercises control over what she exposes, when, and how. This intentionality frames her current life as one of deliberate design rather than reactionary chaos. The video stresses that her public persona is no longer a performance imposed by Hollywood or the media. It is a conscious representation of who she chooses to be and how she navigates the world. Even financial wealth, often cited as a measure of success, is contextualized as secondary to emotional security. Her properties, investments, and net worth are described not as trophies, but as tools for creating sanctuaries, places where her children can grow safely and where she can maintain autonomy. In this view, security is defined not by status, but by the ability to protect and preserve the intimate, daily rhythms of family life. Yet the narrative does not ignore the lingering effects of earlier grief. Pain is never fully erased, only managed. The video frames her ongoing awareness of mortality, change, and the fragility of relationships as elements that deepen her empathy and understanding. These elements do not diminish her accomplishments, but add texture, reinforcing the central theme. The deepest wounds can coexist with the brightest successes. By the conclusion of this section, Julia Roberts emerges as a figure whose public achievements are remarkable, but whose private resilience is profound. The video frames her legacy as multifaceted. She is not only a cinematic icon, but also a woman who has cultivated stability, nurtured relationships, and protected her inner life against the relentless demands of fame. The smile that once symbolized Hollywood's fantasy now reflects lived experience, the triumph of endurance, the wisdom of self-preservation, and the quiet grace of someone who has learned to carry both joy and sorrow simultaneously. Ultimately, the tragedy in Julia Roberts' story, as the video presents it, is not simply that she experienced loss or heartbreak. It is that these experiences have been constant companions alongside public adoration, commercial success, and artistic achievement. Yet it is precisely this intertwining of hardship and triumph that renders her journey compelling. She is admired not only for the role she plays on-screen, but for the life she has sculpted off-screen, a life in which resilience, discretion, and purpose have become her greatest accomplishments. This framing positions her not merely as a star, but as a living testament to the power of surviving, adapting, and finding equilibrium in a world that often demands the impossible. By the mid-2000s, Julia Roberts' life had reached a rhythm that few outside her inner circle could fully perceive. The earlier chapters of public scrutiny, broken engagements, and the relentless pressure of fame had given way to a quieter, more deliberate existence. The video emphasizes that this phase is defined not by new heights of stardom, but by intentionality. Every choice, professional and personal, is now measured against the standard of emotional sustainability. Whereas in her 20s and 30s, she moved at the mercy of circumstance. In her 40s and beyond, she moves with purpose. One of the key elements highlighted is the protective structure she built around her family. Motherhood had transformed not just her daily routine, but her perception of life itself. The narrative underscores that raising children is a form of both personal fulfillment and armor. Meals shared in sunlit kitchens, the sound of laughter echoing across her home, and evening routines where no cameras intrude. All these moments are framed as wealth far beyond net worth or property holdings. The video draws a direct connection between these domestic practices and emotional resilience. Where fame had once demanded constant engagement and visibility, privacy now functions as a form of power, granting her the ability to determine her own narrative. The video repeatedly revisits the theme of loss, framing it as an ongoing companion rather than a past event. Even in this carefully curated life, grief continues to surface. The death of a half-sister, family tensions, and small but poignant losses like pets or changes in household rhythms. These reminders underscore the central thesis of this chapter, that emotional wealth is distinct from material or professional wealth. Happiness and fulfillment are measured not in awards or box office returns, but in the preservation of a life where sorrow can be acknowledged without being amplified or exploited by the outside world. Professional choices during this period are equally intentional. Julia selects roles that reflect her current life perspective, avoiding the frantic pursuit of visibility for its own sake. The video emphasizes that she now approaches acting as a deliberate craft rather than a reactionary necessity. Her performances in television and film projects are framed as explorations of complexity, offering depth and nuance rather than simply reinforcing the image of a romantic icon. In this telling, her artistry is inseparable from her life experience. Her craft is enriched by the accumulation of both triumph and adversity, lending authenticity and subtle power to each role. Public perception is treated with the same careful management. Julia Roberts maintains visibility when it aligns with her personal and professional priorities, yet she enforces boundaries that protect her privacy. The video describes her engagement in philanthropic work, environmental advocacy, and educational initiatives as both deliberate and understated. She does not seek headlines for charity. She channels influence into causes she believes in. In this way, the narrative frames her as a woman whose legacy extends beyond cinema, a figure who leverages her status to create meaningful impact without compromising the sanctity of her personal life. The video underscores the continuity between past and present, demonstrating that the patterns formed during early life experiences remain influential. Childhood instability, the loss of a parent, and the pressures of early fame have left an imprint that informs her decisions today. Her careful curation of private life, disciplined routines, and measured public engagement are all adaptive responses to decades of exposure and vulnerability. Loneliness, once acute and threatening, is now acknowledged and managed rather than allowed to dictate her behavior. Emotional self-awareness becomes a defining characteristic. Yet the narrative does not shy away from the challenges that remain. The video emphasizes that grief, even when managed, continues to shape her experience. Moments of reflection on family losses, the passing of close relations, or the difficulties of balancing career and domestic responsibilities illustrate that stability is a process, not a permanent state. In this framing, Julia's achievements are not the absence of struggle, but the ability to coexist with it. The viewer is encouraged to see resilience as an ongoing practice, one cultivated through conscious choices rather than inevitable fortune. The symbolism of her smile resurfaces in this chapter, evolving from a protective facade to a reflection of enduring strength. Once a camouflage for vulnerability, it now represents survival, adaptability, and a refined understanding of self. It is no longer merely a Hollywood image. It is a testament to a lifetime of navigating loss, expectation, and public scrutiny while maintaining integrity and authenticity. The video situates this transformation as central to her legacy, emphasizing that her influence derives as much from her personal evolution as from her cinematic accomplishments. Finally, the chapter frames her life as a deliberate synthesis of family, career, and personal well-being. Material success is present but secondary. True wealth is the ability to maintain peace, nurture meaningful relationships, and protect her children from external pressures. The narrative presents these choices as both courageous and radical, particularly in an industry that often conflates visibility with worth. Julia Roberts emerges as a figure who has reclaimed agency, crafting a life that harmonizes public accomplishment with private fulfillment. In conclusion, the sixth phase of her story is about equilibrium. Fame, loss, and personal desire coexist within a framework of intentional living. The video emphasizes that emotional literacy, discipline, and protective boundaries are now the metrics by which she navigates life. Rather than chasing external validation, she pursues a sustainable existence where creativity, family, and personal growth intersect. The tragedy of earlier years, the silent enemy of grief and loneliness, is acknowledged but no longer dictates her trajectory. Instead, it informs a deliberate approach to life, illustrating a woman who has learned to carry both joy and sorrow with grace, transforming endurance into a quiet, enduring power that defines her present and shapes her legacy. By the time Julia Roberts entered her late 50s, the contours of her life had settled into a rhythm that balanced public recognition with deeply personal priorities. The video frames this period as one of reflection, measured choice, and careful preservation of the inner world she had fought for over decades. Fame had provided opportunity and influence, yet had also left a trail of lessons learned through loss, disappointment, and constant scrutiny. What emerges is not merely a narrative of triumph, but a nuanced portrait of someone who understands the value of boundaries, the impermanence of attention, and the enduring significance of personal connection. At the center of this narrative is family. The children she nurtured, the home she created, and the marriage she safeguarded are presented as both reward and protection. Daily life, laughter during breakfast, long afternoons spent outdoors, quiet evenings, forms the core of her emotional wealth. The video emphasizes that for Julia, these moments carry more significance than any red carpet appearance, any headline, or any box office figure. Her material assets, homes, investments, even her carefully curated net worth, serve practical purposes rather than symbolic ones, functioning as shields to maintain privacy and stability rather than trophies for public display. Yet the video carefully acknowledges that stability does not erase history. Childhood losses, early experiences of abandonment, and the fractures of past relationships continue to influence her emotional landscape. She carries memories of her father, her half-sister, and other family members with a quiet reverence, integrating their absence into the rhythm of her present rather than allowing it to dictate her behavior. These lingering shadows serve as reminders that resilience is an ongoing practice, one that requires both acknowledgement and management rather than avoidance. In this stage, her career is described as deliberate and refined. She continues to choose roles, but with a discerning eye toward their alignment with her personal and artistic values. Rather than pursuing fame for its own sake, she seeks projects that allow her to explore complexity and authenticity. This careful selection reinforces the video's theme that true power lies in agency, the ability to shape one's own trajectory and define the terms of engagement with the world. In this way, professional decisions are not divorced from personal evolution. They're a reflection of it. The video also emphasizes the evolution of her public presence. Whereas earlier in life visibility was compulsory, now it is intentional. Julia Roberts engages with the media, advocacy, and promotional work selectively, ensuring that her voice is applied to projects and causes she values. Philanthropy and activism are framed as natural extensions of her values rather than instruments of self-promotion. By presenting her in this manner, the narrative portrays her as someone who has translated the lessons of fame, hardship, and public exposure into a deliberate ethical framework for living. Grief and loneliness, once overwhelming forces, are reframed as companions she has learned to carry. The video draws attention to her continued awareness of mortality, change, and the fragility of relationships. Rather than being paralyzing, these elements now inform her decisions and provide perspective, reinforcing the understanding that life's richness is inseparable from its vulnerabilities. Her ability to hold sorrow alongside joy is depicted as a hallmark of maturity, a defining feature of both her personal and professional identity. The symbolism of her smile recurs in this final phase, evolving from its earlier role as camouflage into an emblem of resilience and experience. Once a shield against scrutiny, it now communicates endurance, wisdom, and authenticity. It is a reminder that the external perception of perfection does not equate to internal ease, and that true beauty derives from the capacity to carry hardship gracefully. The video frames this transformation as central to her legacy, suggesting that her influence extends beyond cinematic achievements to encompass emotional intelligence and the cultivation of inner strength. Julia Roberts' management of her private life is also highlighted. The deliberate creation of boundaries, protective routines, and domestic sanctuaries illustrates a conscious commitment to self-preservation. These strategies allow her to maintain agency over her emotional environment, ensuring that public fascination does not erode personal well-being. In a life historically defined by exposure and performance, the ability to cultivate peace is portrayed as a rare and hard-earned victory. The video continues to contextualize her professional achievements within this broader framework. Awards, box office successes, and iconic roles are not dismissed. Rather, they're presented as complementary to her personal growth. They serve as markers of skill, perseverance, and cultural influence, while her private stability provides the foundation upon which those achievements are sustainable. This interplay between public accomplishment and personal equilibrium underscores the narrative that success is multifaceted, combining external recognition with internal fortitude. By the conclusion of this stage, Julia Roberts is depicted as a woman who has integrated past hardships into a coherent, purposeful life. She balances fame with privacy, professional demands with family needs, and external visibility with internal reflection. The video frames her story as a testament to endurance, adaptability, and self-awareness, portraying her as someone who has not merely survived challenges, but transformed them into sources of strength and wisdom. Ultimately, this final phase emphasizes that her legacy is not solely defined by her roles or accolades. It is equally shaped by the choices she has made to protect her family, preserve her privacy, and cultivate emotional resilience. The narrative suggests that these achievements, carefully curated, intentionally lived, represent the culmination of a life spent navigating the interplay of public expectation, personal loss, and professional ambition. Julia Roberts emerges not only as a cinematic icon, but also as a figure whose enduring influence is measured by the grace, wisdom, and quiet courage with which she has lived her life.